Hello and welcome to Bulimia Sucks, because it does. My name is Kate Hudson Hall, and these are real stories from people who are suffering or have suffered an eating disorder. And it's a platform to share relatable and uplifting and inspiring conversations based on bulimia and anorexia and other eating disorders. And episodes include their personal stories of where they are now and their difficult journeys and their steps taken into recovering from their eating disorder. And we'll be talking to a wide variety of people who are going through or have recovered or are recovering. And also to professionals who work with people with an eating disorder. And our guest today is Milda. Now, she had an eating disorder which started with dieting, and then it sort of transformed into bulimia. And she had this for about 5 years. And she tried many avenues to help her recover, including plenty of self-help books and therapies. And she is now fully recovered. And one key tool that helped her was the power of whole nutrition. So she went on to study nutritional therapy and has been successfully practicing ever since, specializing and working with clients with eating disorders. So Milda has joined our show before to share her specific journey, and that was in episode 16. But today she's come back to talk to us and share her wealth of knowledge on how she helps her eating disorders clients to begin to break their difficult behaviors connected to disordered eating patterns and food obsession, so they can begin to enjoy food without guilt, and take back control of their lives with the help of nutrition. So welcome back, Milda.
Thank you so much.
Very kind of fabulous to have you back.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm really excited to be here. And today, after having shared my personal story, sharing some of the tips and things that can really help people recover themselves and just support themselves through recovery, of course, with the power of nutrition that I'm so passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see just, when I talked to you before and listening to you now, I can, you're really passionate about it and I can feel that passion.
Yes, I think especially because I've been through that myself, I really know what things work and what things may not work so well and what can be helpful. So I know that I kind of always have this other, an extra layer that I can sort of see and help people with. So,
yeah. And it's that full understanding, isn't it, of where that person is in their journey and really finding it, I suppose, easier, but really being able to tune in to, the difficult place that they're in at that time and what will help them.
Yes. And it's, as we know, eating disorders are, yes, we have certain labels that almost like labels of what a certain eating disorder might be like. But for each person, it can be so different, right? It can be so different, and they can be. I haven't yet had 2 clients who are exactly the same or go through the journey exactly in the same steps. So I normally have almost like certain steps I might take with clients, but sometimes one person doesn't need a step or needs an extra step, and so I know the layer of complexity that can go through. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us, so when somebody contacts you with regards to an eating disorder, what are the first steps that you sort of take them through?
Well, I guess, first of all, it very much depends on what kind of eating disorder it is. And even if it's, disordered eating, often it has a certain, let's say, a certain set of behaviors or set of, I guess, behaviors and mindset that comes with that. So what I'm going to do with people really depends on what those behaviors are like. right? And so firstly, first of all, I guess on the practical side, I would have a first session with people, and then we would really decide what work together looks like from there. So this first initial session, a lot of the time, is really about getting to know their habits, getting to know their history, having a look at their food diary, just talking to them, getting to know what they're all about. And then I start to give them some practical steps that they can do themselves, and then we can decide how work together looks like. But I always very much focus on the practical steps, because I know that a lot of the time when people work with me, I recommend that they would work with a therapist, a counselor, a psychotherapist, something from the psychological support side, because I know that full recovery is always so much easier to reach when you have all bases covered.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm very much about, okay, these are the practical things you can do. I give people a lot of exercises to do. So it's very much experiential, right? It's not just saying, well, you need to eat this and that. It's actually, let's put a plan together, and not so much like a rigid plan, because lots of people would have done that with diets before, but it's very much a plan that maybe, or I wouldn't actually even call it a plan. It's more guidance, right? Guidance. Let's meet you where you're at, and let's see what steps you can take from here.
Yeah.
So I guess the way I often describe this is I work with people on this kind of like a parallel track, right? So one side of that very much is about nutritional balance. A lot of people, especially with bulimia, often they would be in this nutritional chaos, right? It's like regularity of meals doesn't happen. The blood sugar spikes and crashes are always happening. And so it's just really about let's get your body into a regular eating patterns, into something that's a bit more stable, so you can start the healing process with everything else. Right?
Yeah. So
Mhm.
the helping somebody with the nutritional path that has anorexia and somebody with bulimia or binge eating. So there's differences between the three, isn't there?
Yes. So often I look at it's almost like actually two sides of that, because I see anorexia, and then I see bulimia and binge eating, almost very similar track we'll take with people who are suffering with that. With anorexia, what often happens is people that see me, they either have already had some psychological help, or they are at the stage where they really are ready to change, right? They have almost reached this turning point of knowing, I need help, I want to change this, and I'm ready. I know it's going to be difficult, but I'm ready to receive the help. Yeah. Often if people are not in that place, it's quite tricky it's quite tricky for the reason because, like I said, the sort of these two sides, the anorexia side and the bulimia and binge eating, they're slightly different approaches. Because if you're in a place with anorexia where your BMI is quite low, obviously there's a lot of chemical changes that happen in the brain that create this loop, right? The loop of sometimes this sort of this voice or this other part of people which tells you, not to eat, or if you eat, you're going to gain weight and so on. It's quite loud. And so we come to an agreement that our work together, the initial part with people with anorexia, is going to have to be weight restoration, right? Because if the weight isn't restored, then we can't really do very much in terms of slightly more psychological support, or, mindful eating or healing relationship with food. We can't really do that if they're not at a healthy BMI. Yeah. So often initial part of the process is really restoring weight, right? Yeah. And this is how it's different from bulimia and binge eating. Although there are people with bulimia who have got a low BMI, sometimes actually not a very low BMI. Often it's sort of, close to a healthy BMI, let's say. Yeah.
Yeah. And people with anorexia, so they so you would sort of focus more on the psychological and that negative thinking and the blockages, if you will, with regards to starting to introduce foods and building up their weight.
Again, everyone is very different. I think a lot of the work would actually be, the work just happens by me being there and together coming up with challenges and saying, okay, and especially challenging food rules, right? So someone would say, okay, I can't eat before, 12 o'clock because there's a rule there. So we would challenge that rule. And then we would say, okay, well, your challenge for next week is actually just to eat something, right? Because sometimes they would have well, I can't have breakfast. So we'd say, well, you're not going to have breakfast. You're just going to have something small at this time. And what I tend to notice with people with anorexia is that they get into these loops of thinking, and the thinking can get really rigid because of the restriction. And the rigidity actually can be challenged by just really small things, right? Because often it's, okay, well, I have to have, 10 nuts. So we say, okay, we'll have 11, right? Just by really little things. And once people, the initial time when they make that challenge is really difficult. But once they see they can do it, and what their mind was saying is going to happen, like you're going to gain a stone, hasn't happened, then they think, well, okay, what other lies might it be telling me, right? And then once you make this challenge, you do this challenge once, then everything else becomes a little bit easier. And then we increase these challenges and sort of, and a lot of the time along the process, it's not that I'm pushing them to do it all the time, but they start pushing themselves because they see that they can do it and how different they start feeling. So it's really small steps, but don't underestimate the small steps, I'd say.
So it's taking that specific client and unraveling the muddle that they're thinking at the moment and identifying specifically where they are and what is that first minute step that they can begin to change. And you're right. And then it begins to empower them once they've seen that little tiny change. It's like a seed, isn't it? That can begin to develop and grow.
Yes. And often, sometimes if the habits around food are too rigid and it's too hard to change anything, sometimes we start with habits that are not to do with food, right? So if they've got that around food, they often have that around other habits, or when I wake up, I have to do this and I have to exercise, and it's very that there's not very much flexibility. And so I sometimes do this exercise where I challenge them to do a few things differently, and then they see, and then we talk about it. Okay, so how was that? And sometimes things come up like, oh, well, doing this thing was really difficult, but actually changing this thing was better than I expected. Right. And so then we sort of related back, well, what if the same thing would happen around food? And often it does. Right. So it's not,
and I was going to say that also it's beginning to work with the brain as well, and opening up that they can begin to change and developing that part of the brain and becoming more aware, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, awareness is a big part of the process, whichever eating disorder people might be suffering with.
I always say awareness is the first step.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because often they say, well, I can't change and there's nothing I can do. But then if we change one little thing and they say, well, I thought I couldn't do it and I did, maybe I can do this other step, right? Yes.
It's fascinating. So, and so you would take them forward with those steps very gradually, obviously. And then to build from there with somebody with anorexia.
Yes, I mean, the process, that weight restoration process actually does take the longest time. It does take the longest time because simply the eating disorder tends to fight back a lot. And we do have weekly sessions, and each session flies by because there's so many things to talk about that happened in a week. And there's so many, maybe, whether it's mindset, whether it's other sort of barriers that that came up or that didn't let them complete the challenge. So we sort of take layer by layer off. Okay, well, what if that happened? And the mind says, well, no, I can't do this. But actually, if we flipped it and tried it the other way, and then it works. So this process really of weight restoration, I find with anorexia, is the probably the slowest, takes the longest time, but it's during this process, it's not that we're just working on restoring weight. There's actually a lot of things and realizations that come with that as well. And so that paves the way to all the other work that's to come afterwards. And that's mindful eating, reconnection to the body, reconnecting to hunger and fullness signals, right? And then the end goal, obviously, very often is the intuitive eating, but that's quite down the line, I'd say. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different pathways to address, isn't there?
Yes.
So moving over to people with bulimia and binge eating. So tell us what the difference is between those two.
So the way I'd approach working with people with binge eating and bulimia is that often, I guess, that their motivation, as you know, is variable for everybody, but often I find that people with bulimia and binge eating would implement changes quicker than somebody with anorexia, simply because the binging and the purging, these are such potent systems in their life, such potent energy systems in their life, that they want to change them really quickly. And so their motivation often is, okay, I'm going to do that, although I'm really scared, but I'm just so fed up with this binging and purging. I'm just going to do it, even though I'm scared of it, right? And so with bulimia and binge eating, often people that I see they do not have a low BMI. They would be within normal or slightly over the normal BMI. And because of that, we actually can start doing a lot of the sort of more psychological work and more behavioral work quite quickly. And so with bulimia, so the step number one really, and I talk about bulimia and binge eating very similarly, because with bulimia, we just have an extra step, which is eliminating purging.
Yes.
And with binge eating, we don't really have that, because obviously vomiting creates almost like a certain, feeling, I guess, in the body, almost like this attachment to the feeling that endorphins create, right? And so that doesn't happen with binge eating. So that's just that extra step. But the other steps are very, very similar. So we would start with, I always start with the regular eating and balancing people nutritionally. So that often is, a lot of the time people go in these loops of, okay, I had a binge and a purge, and now I'm going to restrict because, I'm going to restrict, and then they end up in the same binge purge cycle. Yeah. So the first steps is really making sure that people eat regularly. So when I say regularly, for particularly the whole underlying work that I do with people, it's pretty much based on blood sugar balance and regulation. And so that regular eating is, if someone is binging and purging, every day or more, that would be the regular eating with me in eating every 3 hours, right? So to make sure that you don't have big gaps between your meals. And to be fair, for every person, I adjust that a little bit, because just by looking at their food diary and seeing how their day is, what they do through the day and so on. For somebody who maybe wakes up, I don't know, at 9 o'clock, right? As a student, wakes up at 9 o'clock, and then they maybe go to bed quite early, for example, that happens. They may not need all 6 meals.
Yes.
Right. Yes. But for somebody who, let's say, wakes up at 5 o'clock and has 2 children, and there's just a lot going on, they really do need that regularity in place, right? It's like clockwork. And this really eating every 3 hours, which can be difficult for people if, they go days without eating regularly, right? Yeah. So it's just this, because what happens in this regular eating, people have this container where they know whatever happens, actually, I come back to this container of regular eating, and then my body can restore by itself. The cravings start to reduce by themselves, the urges, so I don't have to fight them so much. Yeah. Right? And I think that's a big one.
I think that's really important for people to hear that, that it will reduce that it will start to reduce that need to that urge to binge and purge once they're eating regularly.
I always say that to clients, and they say, I don't know if that's going to happen to me, Everyone says that, but then they say, but I'm going to trust you because so far what you said worked. And then after a few weeks, they start to see that actually it reduces, and they don't have to fight that urge so much. They say like after a few weeks, maybe a month, maybe a bit longer, they actually realize that because of regular eating, that urge becomes something like more like a suggestion that you can take it or leave it. So actually, this is where you can start feeling more in control. It becomes a choice, right? Whereas previously it feels like autopilot. There's nothing I can do. I can't change this. And a lot of that is to do with blood sugar regulation and those spikes and crashes.
So good.
Which was
so
also a big lesson for me.
So then how do you take that forward from there? What other?
So regular eating often, again, I say, okay, a few weeks. For some people, it's a few months until they really get the hang of it. And they might have a few relapses along the way. And they might think, okay, well, I've got this. Or let's say, oh, I haven't binged and purged for 3 weeks. And then they start to restrict a little bit, whether it's conscious or subconscious. And then they might have a relapse. So these situations are actually really good because we can work through them and say, well, what happened this time? Because the mind keeps saying, well, okay, I'm not purging anymore, so maybe I'll just restrict so I lose some weight, for example, right? And then they see straight away a lapse happens, okay? So often that might take a few months. And then we really focus on, if the purging itself hasn't gone by that point, then we would use tools. And like I said, if we've got these, if the urge becomes this more of a suggestion, then we really work on building the person up, getting them into a place of being really resilient so they can say no to those urges at certain situations. Or maybe we say, okay, what times of the day those situations happen? And often that might be the evening. The evening is a big time. And I think another reason is because that's the time our willpower is depleted as well. So just really seeing, okay, what are other points for the person that still make lapses happen, right? And I guess, okay, so that's, a big process. It's a journey, and there are many things that I might use, but essentially what we try then to move on to is we start making, and these next few steps, they are often interchangeable for people. So I wouldn't say, we wouldn't say, okay, well, for 2 months now we do this for a month. And then for this, they often sort of link into each other. So I just sort of feel out what's the best tool that I could give the person at this stage, what would help the most. And the next things that we would do would be things like starting to eliminate fear foods, right? So depending some person, we might write a list of sort of safe foods, sometimes foods and never foods, or traffic light foods, right? And so, and we would start to add in one food of the sometimes into more of the always, right? So starting to incorporate those fear foods one by one. And that's a process in itself. And we would also work on eliminating food rules, really similar to what we do with anorexia as well. So people have all sorts of food rules, obviously, and they're all different, can be. Some of the more common ones might be, I can't eat after 6 o'clock, or I've heard interesting food rules. There would be things like, I can't have 2 things that are high in fat in one meal, for example, or I can't have, carbs and protein together, various things. So we kind of would work through them and think, well, where do these rules come from? What are they about? And is this serving you, right? So things like that. And then we could move into mindful eating, and then intuitive eating, of course. But the mindful eating, that's probably one of my favorite parts, because
because most people don't do it.
One of the reasons, but another reason is because so many people learn so much about themselves in this part. Because most people think, well, mindful eating, okay, that's easy. But actually, that's the most difficult part for most people, because you have to be slow and present with food. And, if you've been binging and purging sort of on autopilot for decades or many years, it's quite hard to slow down. But when they do, they realize, oh, my body is responding to that. Mindful eating is also the place where we would learn to reconnect with the body. And especially things that people are mostly worried about are, I've ruined my hunger signals, right? I don't know when I'm hungry, when I'm full. So the mindful eating part is where we start looking into the hunger scale, and we really start to sensitize those signals for hunger, fullness. And that in itself, I find, is transformational for people, because they realize, if I'm really attuned to those hunger signals, I never actually need to worry about weight or diets or weight loss, because actually my body will, this automatic inbuilt system is going to tell me if I know how to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because your body knows how much food you need. And everybody's different. It depends how much, people move their body to how much food they need, but there are signals there. And, they've been overridden. And so it's tuning in with mindful eating. It's tuning back into actually what really is your body telling you. And using the hunger scale is an excellent way to begin to do that. So tell us about the hunger scale.
So something interesting that you just mentioned about overriding, right? So those signals, as we were children and babies, we had this system and we used it very well. And so we didn't think, even if it was the tastiest food in front of us, when we had enough, we had enough. So when those signals become overridden, it's whether diets, whether it's information from around us that actually says, well, you shouldn't be having as much, although maybe your body's saying something different, right? And so, and for, like I said, for some people, this process has been happening for years and even decades. And so for them to think that they can trust their body is just not an option. And where I guess a lot of people get stuck when they come to see me, some people have tried mindful eating, the intuitive eating already, and they just got even more confused. And this is where I always say, okay, but it's important to go through these steps with nutrition where you're actually balanced in order to start mindful intuitive eating. Because if you're not, you could be going in these spikes and crashes of blood sugar. And all you want all the time might be sugar and simple carbohydrates. That doesn't necessarily mean your body is balanced. That just means that perhaps it's out of balance and it's sending you wrong signals. And then you're eating, donuts and brownies all the time. And you start to become quite scared that this is what my body is going to want all the time. So the hunger scale, really the process of working with the hunger scale is reconnecting to these signals in a controlled way, and when I say controlled, it's, doing regular eating. And with regular eating, then we start the challenge. So the first thing I do, I have this handout that I give to people with a hunger scale. They actually have the scale that they can see there. And with each I use sort of 0 to 10. I know different people use a different way, but for me, 0 is ravenously hungry, can't even focus. And 10 for me is really, really full.
That's how I do it. That kind of makes sense to me. That's how I teach it.
Same for me. I know people do it the other way around sometimes. So I use that. And I always say to people that, so what I ask them to do, because people write food diary when they work with me, and I just ask them to take, 10 seconds before each meal and just look through the scale and just let me know where you're at. So they can say, a 3, a 4 when I start eating, right? And then later, so we first just work with hunger. So we first work with hunger, maybe a few weeks until people get comfortable. And then I start to incorporate the fullness. And what I notice, so people who have had bulimia and binge eating, they often struggle to gauge hunger very well. And people who struggle with anorexia often struggle to gauge fullness, or they say they're full much earlier than they actually are. So the moment they start to feel food coming in, they say I'm full, but then an hour later they're hungry again. So it's these kind of subtle parts of that. So that's, I guess, the hunger scale. And with time, what people start to see is that with time, they start to see that they really, what am I trying to say here with the, with the scale? Sorry, just lost my train of thought, but it will come back in a moment.
That's kind of a guide to help them to begin to really tune into their body and how to, how to understand it, to be able to kind of support the amount of food that they're eating.
Yes, absolutely. And hunger scale is one part, but often I use other tools as well. For example, there might be some body scan meditations that I would ask people to do, right? Because actually when you're using the body scan, it's not just about the food, but it's also what other parts of your body are, what other sensations can you notice? And I guess it's very much, I imagine, similar to the work you do when it comes to noticing emotions. Again, right? It's where they are in the body. And sometimes they, emotions can be so linked with hunger, particularly with eating disorders. And not necessarily true hunger, but understanding that I'm hungry and I need to cope with this. And what's interesting, actually, another part of the hunger scale that I do is I ask people how they know that they're hungry, and really just starting to recognize those first initial, understanding that I'm hungry. And what's interesting is that really not a big amount of people have actual physical sensations or cues in their stomach and digestive tract. Often it's a lot of, moods or lack of focus or maybe irritation, so different things. And so what some of the most interesting things I've heard when I ask people, okay, tell me 4 or 5 things that tell you that you're hungry. And people have told me interesting things like I get tingling in my hands. Or one person said that she would get this constriction in her throat that she also gets when she feels anxious. So that for me was very interesting because for some people that those emotions can be, very much mimicking hunger sometimes.
Yeah. And it's making those signals, whatever they may be, maybe it's, a number of different signals, like you say, it's making those as conscious as possible and as big as possible for you to be able to see and feel them easier, isn't it?
And sometimes the work we do, for example, with mindful eating or a hunger scale, at the beginning, when we start the regular eating, it's almost every week we add something new. And once we get into the mindful eating part, it's actually the same work that we have to do for longer periods of time. And people sometimes get impatient. I want more goals, or I want to do this quicker. And actually the process really with mindful eating happens when we manage expectations. And let's say you go through 3 or 4 weeks of mindful eating, and then let's say 4th week you have this breakthrough and you think, oh my God, now I really understand this. Right. So it's just really trying to stay with it and knowing that even if you can't really pick up the hunger and fullness just yet, with time something clicks just by doing it over and over. It's like a skill, I guess. And
it's creating that positive neural pathway in your brain, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
By doing it over and over again.
Exactly. And I guess giving a bit of trust to your body, right? If someone hasn't trusted their body very much for a long time, it's also a big step to say, my body will know what to do.
And then after that, so where do you take them? How do you take them forward from there?
So I guess the next step really is intuitive eating. And that, as we know, is probably a lifelong learning. But we start looking into the main sort of principles of mindful eating. I often give people a mindful eating. I keep confusing it. Intuitive eating. I often give people once I feel like, okay, let's go into, at some point of the journey, actually, I would give them the intuitive eating assessment, and they just sort of tick, where they feel like. And the assessment really gives us an idea of where they might be at in intuitive eating. And so then we work by that, because it could be, oh, actually, there are still times when I feel like I'm eating because of my emotions, or there are times when I can't trust my hunger. And then we talk about which particular time. So we kind of hone in on those areas where they don't feel very strong let's say, or they feel they still have challenges. And then similar, I often, usually at this stage, we still have some regular eating that has a container in place, because again, that's easier to practice things when it's that way. And so let's say with intuitive eating, we maybe would take one meal per day, and we would say, okay, well, maybe you don't prepare for this meal, and then you just feel what is it that you'd like to eat at that time, right? So maybe you have a few options, and then you just feel out what would be nice for me today. So it's like, yeah, just kind of like I said, like a controlled way of experimenting to start with. And then things start to become a bit looser and looser and looser. And then maybe we reduce the food diary. Maybe, you know, when that was pre-COVID, you know, when the cafes would be open, people would go out more, and still, you know, so at those times would be really great times for experimentation and challenging themselves.
Yeah.
Of thinking, well, what is it that I want to have today and now? Yes.
So, Milda, one thing that I wanted to ask you is, which is, as we both know, is huge for people, particularly with bulimia, about the bulimia bloat.
Great.
What do you advise your clients about the bulimia bloat?
Excellent question. I'm really pleased you asked me, because it happens to 95% of people.
Yeah.
And that initial bulimia bloat, I always say, okay, there are a few things. So really good to calm the mind down, and knowing, you know, often that bloat is associated, you know, people use even the word "I'm bloated" interchangeably with "I've eaten a lot." And so I think we need to separate that, because sometimes people think that I'm bloated, which means I've overeaten. And often when they start the recovery process, the bloating can be anything from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, really depending. And often that bloat is actually nothing to do with them having eaten a lot. It's really, like I say, it's your body is healing itself. And so it needs to, again, create this protection almost, right? So to know that those organs are protected, that, you know, I say, okay, bloating is actually a really positive thing. And I remember from Bulimia Help Method, we would say that, you know, bloated belly is a healing belly. And using this mantra to remind people that actually this is a good thing. Your body is having enough resources so it can restore itself. And just reminding that it's only that bad in the first 2 to 6 weeks. And then you can, you know, it's probably aren't going to worry about it unless there's other imbalances going on. Right. So in this bloat time, what I would say, some simple things to do, very important to make sure you're comfortable. So wearing clothes that make you feel comfortable. So maybe looser clothes for now, but it's just really important to make sure that people are comfortable. Making sure they drink enough. Also trying not to drink too much. Some people overhydrate. So I would say anything
that you know, it's drinking gradually, building it up, isn't it?
Yes, but also, you know, if they drink too much, they can wash out electrolytes, which happens a lot with eating disorders. So probably, you know, fluid wise, 2 liters is an average, and that's a good one.
Or to build up to that, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, most people probably will drink anything from 1 liter to, you know, 2 liters. So I think trying to stay with that, not going to 3 liters, even if they're exercising, because that can get a bit dangerous. There are some teas that can really help reduce bloating. So, for example, peppermint tea helps.
Right.
Chamomile, ginger and lemon, ginger in particular, whether it's dried or fresh. These probably are. Fennel tea is also really good. So these few is a really good idea to have some sort of in between meals if they experience bloating. And another thing that I know not many people will be happy about, but actually one of the macronutrients that really helps reduce bloating is fats. Right? So I actually say to people, increasing the amount of fats they have, especially in that time, really helps reduce bloating. Yeah. So I think these are a few things.
And gentle exercises also.
gentle exercises, yoga that's not power yoga, but more sort of restorative and yin, stretching, self-massage can be really good as well. And that also helps improve body image. So a few things there.
And what would you suggest about taking probiotics?
I think that's a tricky one because there are so many different types of probiotics. And especially if we don't quite know exactly what's going on at any point, in the gut, a lot of the time what can happen, the eating disorder can trigger an imbalance in the gut. And so for a person, certain probiotics might help and certain might make things worse.
Yeah.
So with this, I'd probably say I'm a bit wary of using them. With some people, I feel like, okay, this person, maybe they don't have, I tend to take it case by case basis on their health history, where they're at. Yeah. And, there might be some other things. For example, if the bloating is quite bad, at the beginning, just perhaps for some people, digestive enzymes help because they might have, the body's not breaking down food very well. So actually digestive enzymes could be a bit more beneficial than probiotics at this stage. But often in the healing stage, okay, maybe when all the bloating is done and then you go into intuitive eating, then you can experiment with probiotics to sort of rebuild the flora. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, so it's really interesting.
Yes, it is.
Because that's a difficult one for so many people, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to think about, I guess, and that's why it's useful to work with somebody because they can sort of guide you in the right direction. And there are many steps.
And once they've sort of made their way through to the intuitive eating, so what are some of the positive benefits that they could focus on to look forward to, I suppose?
As in, what would be the end goal? Where would they get
How
to?
would they feel? Yeah.
Excuse me. So I'd say with intuitive eating, people really want to get to a place where, of course, there's all these things like not thinking about food all the time. And yes, there is an aspect of, eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full, but I guess it's so much more complicated, I guess, than that. It's just feeling relaxed around food and knowing that even if...
And they'll feel calmer, won't they? And their emotions will feel a lot more...
Absolutely. Calmer.
Kind of more stabilized. Mood becomes more stabilized.
Yes, I guess there is focus around food in terms that, they do still need to eat, but it doesn't create so much stress, and knowing that, even if I have a challenging situation around food, I'm going to handle it.
Yeah.
Right. So things like that. So definitely more relaxed around food, feeling like they can join in with other people. Almost like being flexible in food situations. So let's say spontaneity around food, right? So all these things that don't create stress. Yes.
Yeah. And their sleeping will begin to improve, won't it?
Well, sleep often starts to improve already with regular eating. So really quite soon, because when you balance blood sugar, that affects the hormones. So insulin is very much linked to all the other hormones, including melatonin, which serotonin, melatonin. Serotonin is also responsible for appetite regulation, and that gets transferred into melatonin, which is sleep. So very, very soon into the process, people would see physical changes. So the moods improve, sleep improves, digestion often improves, because that whole process of blood sugar balance starts to bring this all together balance into their lives. The bowel movements often improve, right? So regularity starts to come. So it's just all these positive signs that so much in the body is restoring.
Amazing.
It is, isn't it? Yes.
Okay, so we're coming to our end here, Milda. So what else would you advise people with regards to the nutritional side of it?
Let's think. Well, I'm not really sure. I think,
What about other vitamins?
okay, yes. Yes, I guess. So I often do suggest people take supplements at certain stages. Obviously, if someone is with anorexia, where they're at low BMI, I often don't necessarily give supplements straight away, so that that the mindset isn't that I can just have supplements and it will be okay, right?
Yeah.
It's we try to get to a point where they're eating more food, unless of course they go to the GP and they say you need to take a supplement of iron, potassium, or something like that. So that's obviously has to happen. Generally, for people in the UK, from probably October time to maybe March, April, I would say until the sun comes out, I do give a supplement of vitamin D. Definitely to take, because not only the immune system, but also bones and moods in particular, that really can support. And then again, I look at it from case by case. So for some people, for many people, I would give magnesium, because it's something that helps to relax. It also helps a little bit with blood sugar balance, helps with sleep. So these probably are the ones that people could look into themselves. And then again, case by case, maybe other supplements, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily tell people to get themselves. I would say speak to a professional.
Yeah, that's what they've got to do.
Yes, exactly.
First of all.
Yes.
What would you say about zinc?
Yes, so there's a big thing around zinc, of course, with eating disorders, especially with anorexia. In many cases, if I see that people need a little bit of a lift, let's say they just need a bit of motivation, a bit of energy, I might suggest a type of multi-supplement, often that'd be a big part of magnesium.
What's it called?
Have a multivitamin. So they would have
multivitamin. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. So they would have a big part of magnesium, and probably they would have B vitamins and some trace minerals, and often they would have some zinc. So right. I know that there's a lot around zinc. I wouldn't, for some people, I would give it, I just really would look by their symptoms often. To see, okay, if they also have bad nails and hair, and a lot of people do. So then I would suggest something extra.
Yeah. Yes. And what about omega-3?
Yes, that's another one that I often do suggest for people to have. And for some people, we manage to add a little bit more by eating fish, because it really depends on the person. But I often, the ones I mentioned, probably vitamin D, magnesium, either digestive enzymes, or later on probiotics, and omega-3s, and maybe a multivitamin sometimes, would be probably my go-tos that I would use with a lot of people. But then with other people might be something extra. But omega-3 can be very useful. A lot of the time, many people are actually not, are in this imbalance of omega-3s and omega-6s.
Yeah. So that's really interesting.
Yes.
Wow, there's a lot of information that people can take away from this show. And is there anything else that you would like to add, Milda?
Well, I think that another big thing, which obviously not just nutrition, but life in general, is the big part of what we do a lot of the time is stress resilience. And I think that's just so huge. Stress resilience can be so huge because it can deplete people from, stressful times deplete people from nutrients physically. And of course, they can trigger eating disorder behaviors. So another big part that we do is, with some people, it's 70% of the time we work on stress resilience in various different ways. So whether it's techniques, whether it's really just about finding a way for the person that helps them take away the anxiety and the stress easier.
Yeah. And what sort of techniques or ways would you help people?
So some of the ones that I tend to go to a lot is breathing exercises, because breathing exercises can be used anywhere, They take minutes. They're free, right? So many benefits to that. And so they work really quickly as well, because they can reduce the adrenaline and cortisol in the body. And so within 3-5 minutes, a person can feel really calm, well, much calmer than they were before. So I do love this. Meditation, of course, that's, there are so many different types. I'm a big advocate and fan of meditation. I have to do it myself every day because it really helps. So I do try to support people towards implementing that themselves. But we find the way, whichever meditations work for people. So we experiment often with a few until we find something. Yoga is great if people can do that. Then there can be things, like just playing some music and dancing around, right? For some people, that really helps. So being in the body, so this movement, so you can shake out sort of the emotions or anything that's stuck. And for other people, it helps. Other couple of things that really help is either journaling, so writing things, getting things out of their head and journaling, or for some people, they don't like to write, so they talk. So they talk to themselves. They might talk into their phone, might record it and then delete it. So whatever helps is just taking all that stress and thoughts out of their head. It really helps.
Absolutely. And then start to free up a bit of space in there to be able to think differently and think more positively.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. Oh, well, Milda, thank you so much. This has been excellent.
Pleasure. Yes.
So much information for people to learn from.
Yes. And I think, just by listening to this, I guess they'll see that there are so many things that they can do. I would say try not to get overwhelmed, because that's when if we start to do everything, that's when it can feel like too much. I would say, taking a step by step, and for example, with stress resilience exercises, I would start to try one and try one a few times and see if that works. And if it doesn't, maybe move on to another one, but not trying to do everything, because when overwhelm comes, it feels like I can't do anything and I drop everything. So
absolutely. And like you said in the beginning, it's taking that one little step forward that will begin to help you and support you in your further steps forward.
Yes.
So really minute, however smaller step you need to take.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Milda.
Pleasure.
Sharing all this amazing information. So that's all for today's episode of Bulimia Sucks. And thank you for listening and for joining us today. And join us again on the next episode, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple iTunes, so you never miss an episode. If you haven't already heard about it, check out my book on Amazon called Bulimia Sucks, to learn many different techniques to help you to begin to break through your painful bulimic behaviors. And also it's about to come out as an audio book, which I'm very excited about, which will be in the next month. So I will keep you up to date on that. So thanks for listening to Milda and I. And before we go, show us what you think about the show, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or iTunes or wherever you listen. And then come and join our Facebook group, Bulimia Sucks, if you haven't already, where it's great to connect with like-minded people and chat about their ups and downs. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the next episode.